Welcome to our channel. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the book Big Questions of Life by Om Swami. It's really interesting. It's one of those books that kind of explores all the big questions we have, using his own stories, some ancient wisdom, and a lot of philosophical insights.
Yeah, and it's not like your typical self-help book. It's more like a guide to navigating life, the ups, the downs, and helps you understand things like loss and happiness and freedom and even narcissism.
Yeah, it's not just about offering quick fixes,
Yeah.
It's about finding a new way to think about the challenges that we face. One story that really stuck with me was the one about the author's father losing some of his pension money. I mean, his reaction was so different from his wife's.
Oh, yeah. That's a perfect example of how this book explores the whole idea of control, or the illusion of control, I should say. His father was completely devastated by it. He was stuck in the what ifs. And his mother, on the other hand, accepted it, with like the surprising calmness. It really shows just how much of our suffering is tied to this need to control every little thing.
It makes me think about all those times I've been caught off guard by something. It's like you're driving along thinking you're in control, and then suddenly you're just a passenger. Have you ever felt that way, like that loss of control, and how did you deal with it?
Oh, for sure. And the book uses that personal story to connect with this bigger philosophical idea, that we just can't control everything. And by fighting that reality, we often create more suffering for ourselves.
So acceptance is key. But but the book doesn't just say, "Hey, accept everything passively,"
Mhm.
right? It gives you some tools to deal with those inevitable challenges.
Exactly. And one of the most memorable analogies is the burning coal. Do you remember the story about the Zen master and the geisha? They're both given this burning coal, right, representing adversity. The geisha panics and ends up burning her expensive kimono, trying to get rid of it quickly. But the Zen master, he just calmly uses it to light his pipe.
I love that story. It's
Yeah,
like sometimes we react so strongly to problems that we just make things worse. It reminds me of that saying, "What you resist persists."
exactly right. The book argues that pain is inevitable, but suffering is actually a choice. We can choose to panic and resist, or we can pause and accept the situation and find a more skillful way to respond.
So how do we become more like the Zen master? It's one thing to say, accept the burning coal, but how do you actually do that when you're in the middle of something really difficult?
Yeah, well, that's where self-awareness comes in. The book highlights, how important it is to understand your own patterns, your own reactions. Do you tend to get overwhelmed easily, or do you approach things with a sense of curiosity and calm? Recognizing those patterns is the first step to changing them.
It's like knowing your default settings before you can reprogram them. And speaking of reprogramming, this book has this other really cool analogy, the Scrabble board of life.
Ah, yes, the Scrabble board. It's a brilliant way to visualize how we approach those challenges in life. Imagine you're dealt a random set of letters, right? Some are great, some not so much. You can't control the letters you get, just like you can't control every circumstance in life.
But you can control how you play the game. You can use your skills and strategy to make the best of what you've got.
Exactly. The book says that knowledge and skill are crucial for navigating the game of life. It's about developing wisdom and self-awareness and making choices that are in line with your values.
So it's like you're constantly learning new Scrabble words, gaining new skills to deal with whatever life throws your way.
Precisely. And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. What skills do you think are most important for playing this game of life well? What are your power words, so to speak?
Hmm, that's a good question. I think resilience is a big one, being able to bounce back from setbacks and keep going.
Definitely. Resilience is essential, and it ties in perfectly with that earlier point about accepting what you can't control. The more resilient you are, the better equipped you'll be to handle those curveballs life throws at you.
And maybe adapt your creativity too, like finding those innovative solutions when you're dealt a tough hand in life.
Oh, creativity is a fantastic skill to have, for sure. It lets you think outside the box and come up with those solutions when things get tough. And it really connects with the book's focus on personal growth.
Speaking of growth, this book really encourages you to think beyond the surface. It delves into some pretty deep concepts like the transient nature of everything. There's this story about Pingala, a courtesan who learns this lesson the hard way.
Pingala's story, it's heartbreaking, but so insightful. She becomes fixated on this prince who promises to visit her and spends the entire day preparing. But he never shows up, and she's left completely devastated.
It's like she built her whole happiness around this one event, this one person.
And that's the danger of attaching your happiness to external things, right? The book brings up this Buddhist concept of impermanence, this idea that everything is in constant change, nothing is permanent.
So if you're clinging to things that are by nature fleeting, things, possessions, status, even relationships, you're setting yourself up for disappointment.
Absolutely. The book argues that real lasting happiness isn't found in external things. It's about finding a deeper sense of peace and contentment that comes from within.
Which makes me think about those times when you really crave something, a new gadget or a promotion, whatever it is. Maybe it's worth pausing and asking yourself, will this really make me happy, or am I just chasing something fleeting?
That is a fantastic question to ask yourself. It's about becoming more mindful of where you're placing your sense of fulfillment. And, for those listening who are looking for ways to cultivate a more positive mindset and find that inner peace, you should check out the Affirmify Journey YouTube channel. They have some really great resources on that.
That's a great recommendation. Now let's talk about freedom. The book doesn't just mention it, it really explores what true freedom means.
And it's not just about doing whatever you want, is it? The book uses the simple story about a boy who breaks a milk jug while he's home alone. He tries to lie about it, but his mother gently encourages him to own up to his mistake.
Oh, that's so relatable. I think we've all been there trying to avoid responsibility for something.
Mm.
But the book suggests that true freedom is actually tied to responsibility.
Precisely. It argues that freedom isn't just the absence of constraints, but the ability to make choices and accept the consequences of those choices.
So it's like the more responsible you become, the more freedom you actually have.
That's an interesting way to put it. It's about recognizing that real freedom comes with owning your actions and understanding that your choices impact both yourself and others.
It makes you think, what does freedom really mean to you? What freedoms do you value most? And what responsibilities do those freedoms carry?
That's a great question for all of us to consider. What freedoms do we take for granted, and how can we use those freedoms in a way that benefits both ourselves and the world around us?
And how do you see this whole idea of freedom and responsibility playing out in our lives today, with all the choices and complexities we face?
That's a really deep question. It makes me think about the constant influx of information we're all bombarded with these days. The book touches on this too, suggesting that true freedom also involves choosing what information you consume and how you allow it to shape you.
So it's not just about external limitations, but about the internal constraints we put on ourselves, through the information we choose to let in.
Exactly. It's about being mindful of the narratives we're exposed to and consciously choosing those that empower us to live in alignment with our values.
All right, so let's switch gears a bit and talk about apologies. This book doesn't shy away from those difficult conversations.
No, it doesn't. Om Swami shares a pretty vulnerable story about making a huge mistake at work. He accidentally wiped a server clean. It cost the company a lot of money and caused a lot of stress.
Wow, that must have been tough.
It was. But he focuses on the importance of owning up to the mistake and offering a genuine apology,
Right.
No excuses, no blaming others, just taking full responsibility.
That takes a lot of courage.
Yeah.
But the book connects this to narcissism, right?
Yes. It raises the question, can you truly apologize sincerely if you're mainly concerned with protecting your own ego?
So someone with narcissistic tendencies might find it hard to offer a genuine apology because they're so focused on maintaining a certain image.
Exactly. They might apologize in a way that shifts the blame or downplays their role in the situation. The book actually outlines 4 telltale signs of narcissism.
This is really helpful, especially for anyone who's had to deal with a narcissist in their own life.
It's about recognizing those patterns so you can set healthy boundaries and protect your own well-being.
And for those who want to explore strategies for personal growth and a more positive mindset, I highly recommend checking out the Affirmify Journey YouTube channel. They've got some fantastic resources on those topics.
Great suggestion. Now back to the book. It doesn't just point out these potentially challenging personality traits, it offers guidance on navigating them with compassion.
So it's not about labeling people or judging,
Yeah.
but understanding these traits and how they impact our interactions.
Exactly. It's about gaining a deeper understanding of human behavior so you can approach challenging situations with more skill and awareness.
One of the things I find most fascinating in this book is its exploration of stories and their power.
Yes. The section Stories We Tell is really captivating. It dives into how the stories we tell ourselves shape our perceptions and experiences.
And it uses these vivid examples to make the point. Like the story of Mahavira, the founder of Jainism. He runs into these three bandits, and they see him as an easy target, totally missing his spiritual aura.
Right. And then a woman who's just been robbed sees him as a beacon of peace and safety. It's a great example of how our past experiences and biases can totally color how we see things.
We literally see what we want to see and often miss the bigger picture.
Exactly. The book suggests that we can become more aware of these stories we're telling ourselves and actually rewrite the ones that are holding us back. It's about challenging those limiting beliefs and creating a more empowering narrative for ourselves.
So it's like taking control of that internal dialogue and becoming the author of your own story.
That's a great way to put it. We have the power to choose the stories we believe in, both about ourselves and the world around us.
It makes you think about the stories you're telling yourself right now. Are they helping you or are they keeping you stuck? What about you? What stories have you had to rewrite in your own life?
That's a great question to reflect on. We all have those limiting beliefs or narratives that we've held onto for too long. It's about becoming aware of them and consciously choosing to replace them with a more positive and empowering perspective.
Now, the book doesn't shy away from some of the tougher parts of modern life, like loneliness.
It's interesting how Om Swami contrasts the way society views loneliness with the yogic perspective. He talks about how our dependence on technology, the constant need for entertainment, and just the fast pace of modern life all contribute to this feeling of isolation.
It's like we're surrounded by distractions, but that leaves less room for real connection and even quiet introspection.
Exactly. But then he flips the script and presents this yogic view of loneliness as an opportunity rather than something to fear.
An opportunity for what?
For self-discovery. The yogic approach encourages you to embrace solitude as a chance to connect with yourself, to cultivate self-awareness, and to develop a deeper relationship with your own being.
So instead of dreading being alone, you can actually use that time to get to know yourself better.
Precisely. The book offers practical tips on how to find peace in solitude and how to shift your perspective from one of fear and lack to one of self-acceptance and inner richness.
That's a powerful shift. It's like recognizing that you're already whole and complete within yourself, not defined by external validation or the company of others.
And it challenges this idea that we need to be constantly surrounded by people or distractions to be happy. It's about finding that inner contentment that doesn't depend on outside circumstances.
Now let's talk about something I think a lot of us struggle with.
Yeah.
Balancing work and family.
Yeah.
The book has this really compelling story about the 1,000 marbles. Do you remember that one?
Oh, I do. It's a powerful reminder of just how precious our time is. It's about this guy who calculates how many Saturdays the average person has in a lifetime and then buys 1,000 marbles. Each Saturday, he takes out one marble, creating this visual representation of time passing by.
Wow, that's a striking image. It really makes you think about how you're spending your days.
Exactly. The book uses this story to highlight the importance of making conscious choices about how we spend our time. Are we investing it in things that truly matter? Are we making time for our relationships, our passions, our own well-being? Or are we just letting it slip away on autopilot?
It makes you evaluate your own priorities. Am I spending my time on things that bring me joy and fulfillment? Or am I just going through the motions? What are those 1,000 marbles for you? What are the things you absolutely do not want to waste time on?
That's a deep question for all of us to contemplate. For me personally, it's about making sure work doesn't consume every aspect of my life. It's about creating space for those meaningful connections, personal growth, and simply enjoying the present moment.
I think that's so important. Finding that balance between productivity and presence, between achieving your goals and savoring the journey.
And realizing that sometimes slowing down and simply being present with the people you care about is the most productive thing you can do.
Speaking of things that can really disrupt our peace, let's talk about those pesky, intrusive thoughts that pop into our minds at the worst possible times.
Ah, yes. Om Swami uses a very vivid metaphor for those, the tearing thought. He describes them as wild elephants that barge into our peaceful garden, trampling all over our tranquility.
That's a perfect analogy. We've all had those moments where our minds are hijacked by worries, doubts, or anxieties. It's like our inner peace is shattered.
And the book offers some practical advice on how to handle those tearing thoughts. One key point is recognizing that your thoughts are not facts. They're just mental events that you can choose to engage with or dismiss.
So it's about recognizing that you have a choice in how you respond to those thoughts. You don't have to be controlled by them.
Exactly. The book also highlights the importance of meditation as a tool for regaining control of your mind and cultivating inner stillness.
Meditation is definitely a powerful practice. But sometimes, even when you're trying to be mindful, those tearing thoughts can be really persistent. What are some other techniques people can use to quiet their minds and not get swept away by negativity?
That's a great question. It's really about finding what works for you. Some people find journaling helpful, others use affirmations, and some find solace in nature or creative expression. It's about developing a personal toolkit of mental strategies for navigating the ups and downs.
So it's about being proactive and finding those practices that help you cultivate a more peaceful and resilient mind.
Exactly. It's about empowering yourself with the tools and techniques to manage your thoughts and emotions rather than being controlled by them.
Now, this book doesn't just focus on our internal world. It also addresses the importance of our actions and how we can live a more meaningful life. One theme that resonated with me was shedding the past and finding grace.
Oh, yes. This is a powerful section. Om Swami shares a story about a visitor who's struggling with guilt and regret over past mistakes. He uses humor to lighten the mood, comparing past karma to debt collectors, but then he offers a profound perspective.
I love how he uses humor to make these sometimes heavy topics more approachable.
Yeah.
What was that perspective he offered?
He really emphasizes the importance of acknowledging our past mistakes, but without getting stuck in shame or self-blame. He uses this beautiful story from The Way of Chuangzi about a man trying to run away from his shadow to illustrate how pointless it is to try to escape our past.
It's like the more we try to run from it, the closer it gets.
Exactly. The book suggests that true freedom comes from accepting our past, integrating it into our present, and moving forward with compassion and self-forgiveness.
So it's not about denying our past, but about learning from it and using it as a stepping stone for growth.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that all our experiences, both positive and negative, have shaped us into who we are today. And we have the power to choose how we move forward, carrying the wisdom without being burdened by the past.
That's a beautiful way to look at it. It's like taking ownership of your story without letting it define you.
And that leads perfectly into the next part of the conversation, where the book explores this concept of grace and how it can show up in unexpected ways.
I'm intrigued. What kind of story does he use to illustrate this idea of grace?
He shares a really heartwarming story about Swami Raghavananda, a disciple who goes through a series of unfortunate events, including financial hardship and bureaucratic hurdles.
So he's going through a really rough patch.
He is. But despite all the challenges, he keeps his faith and eventually receives unexpected grace in the form of financial help and solutions to his problems.
So even when things seem hopeless, there's this possibility of unexpected support and blessings coming your way.
Exactly. The book reminds us that we're not always in control, and sometimes surrendering to a higher power can lead to positive outcomes that we never saw coming.
It's about trusting that even when things are difficult, there's a bigger picture unfolding that we might not fully understand.
That's a great way to put it. It's about cultivating a sense of trust and being open to those moments of unexpected grace, even when things seem bleak.
Now let's dive into something a little more challenging: betrayal and disappointment.
Yeah, the book tackles this head-on with a story about a military lieutenant who risks his own life to save a wounded comrade, even though his superior officer ordered him not to.
Wow, that's powerful. Talk about loyalty.
It is. Sadly, his friend dies, but the lieutenant finds peace in knowing that he honored his commitment and brought comfort to his dying comrade. He says, "Sir, he's not a dead man, but a martyr. I'm so glad I went back because my dying friend and fellow soldier gripped my hand tightly and kept saying just one thing."
Oh, that's heartbreaking. What did his friend say?
The major softens and asks, "What did he say?"
I can only imagine what that moment must have been like for him.
The lieutenant continues, "Sir, he said, I knew you would come back for me. That's all he said, sir. And it was worth more than everything else put together."
Wow. That's a testament to the power of loyalty and keeping your word.
It really is. It speaks to the depth of human connection and the profound impact of honoring our commitments, even in the face of danger or disapproval.
It's a reminder that true integrity means acting according to your values, even when it's hard or unpopular.
Precisely. It's about cultivating that inner strength and moral courage that allows us to stand by our convictions, even when we're pressured to compromise.
Now, before we move on to the next section, I want to touch on something that's been woven throughout our conversation: the book's use of humor.
Oh, yeah. It's one of the things that makes this book so unique and engaging. It tackles these deep philosophical ideas, but it doesn't get bogged down in seriousness.
Exactly. Even when he's talking about potentially heavy subjects like death or betrayal, He managed to weave in these lighthearted anecdotes or witty observations that make it both insightful and entertaining.
It's refreshing. It makes these complex ideas more accessible and reminds us not to take ourselves too seriously.
Speaking of humor, do you remember that story about the man who makes these promises to his imam, his doctor, and Mullah Nasruddin?
Oh, yes. The one where he asked them to each put $100,000 in his coffin when he dies.
That's the one.
Classic Mullah Nasruddin.
So the man dies, and these three gather at his funeral. The imam confesses that he only put $60,000 in needing the rest for mosque restorations. And the doctor admits he took $75,000 for himself, leaving only $25,000.
And the whole time Mullah Nasruddin is watching them with this look of disapproval.
Yeah, so they finally turn to him and ask, "What about you, Mullah?"
And with a hint of chastisement, he says, "What do you think? I kept my promise and put the whole sum in."
Of course he did.
They're shocked and ask the whole $100,000.
And then comes the punchline.
Mullah replies, "You bet. In fact, to save him the trouble of carrying all that cash, I wrote him a check. He can cash it whenever he likes."
Oh, Mullah Nasruddin, always the trickster. But there's a deeper message there too, right?
For sure.
Yeah.
It's a funny way of reminding us that our commitments matter, even the ones made in jest, and that integrity is key for building trust and healthy relationships.
It's a lighthearted nudge to be true to our word and act with sincerity, even when we're talking about life and death, or in this case, the afterlife.
And it reflects the book's overall message of living a life that aligns with our values. It's not just about what we say, but about our actions and choices, even in those seemingly small moments.
Now let's get into a concept that's central to this book, the spirit of service.
Om Swami uses this great story about Maharana Pratap, a courageous ruler and his humble servant, to illustrate what selfless service really means. The servant, out of love and loyalty, eats 7 pieces of sour mango so his master doesn't have to.
That's a beautiful act of selflessness.
Yeah.
It really embodies putting someone else's well-being above your own without expecting anything in return.
Exactly. The story shows that true service comes from a place of genuine love and compassion, not from a desire for rewards or recognition.
It wasn't about getting praise. It was about protecting his master from something unpleasant.
And it's such a great example of how we can put others' well-being first, even in small, seemingly insignificant ways.
Sometimes it's those little acts of kindness that make the biggest difference.
Absolutely. It's about cultivating that spirit of generosity and compassion in our everyday interactions, not just in grand gestures.
Now, to contrast that spirit of service, Om Swami shares this classic parable about heaven and hell. It's a story that's been around for ages, but it always makes you think.
It's a simple yet profound setting. Both heaven and hell are depicted as these banquet halls with tables full of amazing food, but there's a catch. Everyone's arms are splinted so they can't feed themselves.
What a clever twist.
Yeah.
So what makes heaven and hell different in this story?
Well, in hell, everyone is starving and miserable. They can see the food, they have spoons, but they can't get it to their mouths. And because they're so fixated on their own suffering, they won't help each other.
It's like their selfishness creates their own personal hell.
Exactly. But in heaven, the scene is totally different. Despite having the same physical limitations, the people are joyful and well-fed. They're feeding each other, making sure everyone gets to enjoy the feast.
That's such a beautiful image.
Yeah.
It really highlights how our actions and attitudes toward others shape our experiences.
It's a great reminder that heaven and hell in this context aren't physical places, but rather reflections of our choices and the energy we bring to our interactions.
So by choosing kindness, compassion, and cooperation, we're essentially creating a heaven on earth, not just for ourselves, but for those around us as well.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that our well-being is interconnected and that when we help others, we ultimately help ourselves.
Now, before we move on, I want to touch on another key theme that comes up throughout the book. The importance of choosing positivity.
Oh, absolutely. Om Swami uses this personal story about watching TV with his neighbor, Omar, that really drives this point home. They're flipping through channels and come across a KKK rally, then environmental protests, and finally some heated political arguments.
So, a pretty diverse mix of viewpoints and causes.
But what Om Swami notices is that despite the different contexts, the common thread is anger and negativity.
It's interesting how negativity can manifest in so many different forms.
He points out how the expressions of anger and bitterness are basically the same, whether it's coming from hate groups, activists, or politicians.
It's a powerful observation. It makes you think about the nature of negativity and how it can seep into even seemingly opposing viewpoints.
And it forces you to ask yourself, are you adding to the negativity in the world, or are you choosing to be a force for good and positivity?
That's a great question. It challenges us to really examine our own thoughts, words, and actions, and to be mindful of the impact we're having on the world around us.
And it emphasizes that negativity, regardless of its source or target, creates the same destructive energy.
It's like that saying, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
Exactly. It's about realizing that negativity ultimately hurts us more than it hurts anyone else.
So how do we cultivate more positivity in our lives? Especially when it feels like we're constantly bombarded with negativity from the news, social media, even our own inner critic.
That's a great question. And the book offers some practical advice. One of the key points is to focus on what you can control, your own thoughts, words, and actions.
It's about consciously choosing to focus on the good, even when things are tough.
Right. It's about developing an attitude of gratitude, appreciating the good things in your life, and finding joy in simple pleasures.
And recognizing that positivity isn't about denying negative emotions, but about choosing to focus on the light, even when surrounded by darkness.
Exactly. It's about cultivating a mindset of love, kindness, and understanding, even in the face of challenges and adversity. It's about recognizing that sometimes slowing down and just being present with those you care about is the most productive thing you can do.
Okay, so speaking of things that can really disrupt our peace,
Yeah.
let's talk about those pesky intrusive thoughts. You know, the ones that pop up at the worst times.
Yeah, those are the worst. Swami has this great metaphor for those. He calls them tearing thoughts. He describes them like wild elephants, just barging into a peaceful garden and trampling all over the tranquility.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy. I think we've all experienced that, right? Where our minds are suddenly taken over by worries, doubts, or just that inner critic that says we're not good enough.
Right, and the book emphasizes this really important point. Those tearing thoughts, as disruptive as they can be, they're not facts. They're just mental events like clouds passing through the sky.
So it's about realizing that we have a choice in how we relate to those thoughts. We don't have to get swept up in them every single time.
Exactly. And the book gives some really helpful advice for dealing with these thoughts. One thing that stood out to me was separating the thought itself from the story we build around it. You might have a thought like, I messed up that presentation.
But then our minds tend to add all this extra stuff, right? Like, I messed up, therefore I'm incompetent, and everyone thinks I'm a failure.
That's the story. And it's often way more dramatic than the original thought. The book encourages us to just observe the thought, acknowledge it, but not get caught up in that elaborate, often negative story we spin around it.
That makes a lot of sense. Don't give those tearing thoughts more power than they deserve.
Right. And for building that ability to just observe your thoughts without judgment, the book highlights the importance of meditation.
Oh, meditation can be so helpful for calming the mind. But it's not always easy to just sit down and do it, especially when you're feeling anxious or overwhelmed.
And the book acknowledges that. It's not about becoming some kind of meditation expert overnight. It's about starting small, even just a few minutes each day, and slowly building up that mental muscle.
I think it's also about finding what works for you, right?
Mhm.
Meditation is great, but there are other things people can do, like journaling or spending time in nature or even just taking a few deep breaths.
Absolutely. It's about having a variety of strategies for managing your mind. It's like having a first aid kit for your mental well-being.
So it's about being proactive
Right.
and finding those practices that help you cultivate a more peaceful and resilient mind.
Right. And speaking of things that can fuel those tearing thoughts, the book talks about the role of an overactive imagination.
Oh yeah, it can be a real problem.
The book compares an overactive imagination to a spiritual disorder, which might sound a little extreme at first, but when you really think about it, it makes sense. If you're constantly replaying worst-case scenarios in your head, you're basically torrenting yourself.
It's like your mind is a movie theater that only plays horror films.
And there's this funny anecdote in the book that illustrates this perfectly. A man is walking through a cemetery at night, and he hears music playing backward from a grave. Totally freaked out, he runs into the caretaker.
Oh no, I can only imagine what's going through his mind. Ghosts playing satanic music.
He tells the caretaker about this eerie music, and the caretaker just calmly replies, oh, that's just Mozart. He's buried there, and he likes to play the piano sometimes.
Oh, Mullen is ridden. Always with the perfectly timed jokes.
It's a reminder that we can get so caught up in our own fears and anxieties that we miss the simplest explanations.
And sometimes we just need to step back and laugh at the absurdity of it all.
Yeah. And shifting gears a little, the book also has this really insightful point about how tearing thoughts can sabotage our success and happiness.
You know, it's true. We're often our own worst enemies.
It's not necessarily failure itself that gets us down, but our interpretation of that failure. The book encourages us to reframe failure as a learning opportunity. Instead of asking, why did this happen to me? We can ask, what can I learn from this experience?
It's about moving from a victim mindset to a growth mindset.
Exactly. And remembering that even negative thoughts, like everything else, are impermanent. They'll come and go like waves in the ocean.
The book actually offers a simple recipe for life
Hmm.
to help navigate those tearing thoughts and life's challenges. Do you remember what it is?
Yeah, it's acceptance, understanding, and non-judgment. It's recognizing that our true nature is pure awareness, the silent observer of those thoughts, not the thoughts themselves.
It's about creating that space between ourselves and those thoughts so we're not constantly reacting to them.
Now let's talk about something that can be incredibly difficult, but also incredibly liberating. Forgiveness.
Forgiveness is such a complex topic. It's easy to say, just forgive and forget, but actually doing it is so much harder.
The book starts with this visitor who's struggling with guilt and regret over past mistakes. He asks Om Swami how to let go of all that baggage from the past.
I bet a lot of people can relate to that feeling. We've all made choices we wish we could undo.
Well, Om Swami, with his humor, he compares past karma to these persistent debt collectors. But then he offers this really profound perspective using a story from the Way of Chuang-Tzu called Flight from Shadow.
Just the title alone is intriguing. What's that story about?
Well, it's about this guy who's desperately trying to run away from his shadow. He keeps running faster and faster, but the shadow is always right there with him. Eventually, he just collapses and dies from exhaustion and frustration.
Wow, that's a powerful metaphor for how futile it is to try to escape our past.
Exactly. The more you resist it, the more it holds on. The book suggests that the only way to truly shed that shadow, to move on, is to embrace it.
So you're saying that to let go of the past, we actually have to accept it.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging those past mistakes, learning from them, and integrating them into our present with compassion and understanding.
It's about making peace with our past selves so that we can move forward with a lighter heart.
And forgiveness isn't just about letting go of those past hurts, but also releasing ourselves from guilt and self-judgment. We can be incredibly hard on ourselves.
It's true, sometimes the hardest person to forgive is ourselves.
The book reminds us that we're all human. We all make mistakes. True growth comes from learning from those mistakes and treating ourselves with compassion.
I think it's important to mention that forgiveness is not always a linear process. It's not like you just flick a switch and everything's okay.
Oh, absolutely. There will be moments where anger, resentment, or sadness come up, and that's perfectly normal. It's about allowing yourself to feel those emotions without judgment and continuing to choose forgiveness each step of the way.
And sometimes forgiveness might mean setting boundaries or even creating some distance from those who've hurt us. It's not always about reconciliation.
Right. Forgiveness doesn't mean condoning harmful behavior. It's about finding a way to heal those wounds and move forward with a sense of peace and clarity.
This conversation about forgiveness really makes me think about the broader topic of relationships and the challenges of finding genuine connection in a world that often feels so superficial.
Oh, absolutely. And Om Swami has so many insightful observations about this in the book. He talks about all the people he's met who are struggling in their relationships or feeling lonely. And such a universal experience, that longing for connection and belonging.
Yeah, it's like this paradox. We're more connected than ever through technology, but so many people feel isolated and alone.
He notices that a lot of people are desperately looking for a partner, believing that finding the one will magically solve their problems and bring them lasting happiness. They're looking for someone to complete them.
It's that fairy tale idea again, that someone else will swoop in and make everything perfect.
Right, but he also talks about how even people who are in committed relationships can still feel unfulfilled or stifled. Maybe they're yearning for more freedom or a different kind of connection or even a deeper sense of purpose. It shows how complex relationships can be.
It seems like sometimes the source of our unhappiness might be deeper than the relationship itself.
And the book emphasizes this really important point, that we need to find fulfillment within ourselves before we can truly find it in our relationships with others.
So it's about cultivating that sense of wholeness and happiness within ourselves and not expecting someone else to do that for us.
Exactly. It's about realizing that true love and fulfillment start with self-love and self-acceptance.
It reminds me of that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup. You have to fill yourself up first before you can give to others.
Absolutely. And speaking of relationships, the book also delves into the challenges of maintaining healthy relationships once we found them.
Yeah, it often feels like staying in love is harder than falling in love.
It definitely takes effort, compromise, and a willingness to grow and evolve together, which isn't always easy. It's so easy to fall into that trap of wanting to change our partners, especially after we've been together for a while and that initial infatuation starts to fade.
You start noticing those little flaws or quirks, and you might try to mold them into what you think they should be.
And to illustrate this point, Om Swami uses this really thought-provoking analogy from Nassim Taleb's book, The Bed of Procrustes.
Oh yeah, the innkeeper who would stretch or amputate his guests to fit them into his perfectly sized bed. What a crazy story.
It's a powerful metaphor, right? For how we can distort our relationships by trying to force our partners to fit into some preconceived mold.
So the key, accepting our partners for who they are, flaws, and while also allowing room for growth and change.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance of acceptance, communication, and letting go of our need to control the relationship or the other person.
And realizing that our partners are on their own journeys and we can't force them to follow our timelines or expectations.
It's about honoring their individuality while also nurturing the connection we share.
This whole conversation makes me think about that idea of living with intention and purpose that we talked about earlier. It seems particularly relevant when it comes to relationships.
Oh, absolutely. It's about being present and appreciating those small moments of connection and nurturing those bonds that bring us joy and meaning.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that our time with loved ones is precious and not taking it for granted.
Exactly. Now let's shift gears a little bit and explore the challenges of betrayal and staying true to ourselves in difficult situations.
Betrayal can be such a painful experience. It can really shake your faith in people.
The book tackles this head-on with a story about a military lieutenant who defies orders to rescue his wounded comrade. He knows it could cost him his life, but he does it anyway.
Wow, what an act of courage and loyalty.
It really is. Sadly, his friend dies, but the lieutenant finds some peace in knowing he honored his commitment and brought comfort to his friend in his final moments.
That's a powerful reminder that sometimes doing what's right comes at a high personal cost.
It speaks to the importance of acting in accordance with our values, even when it's difficult or unpopular.
Now let's go to a lighter story about betrayal. Remember the one about the man who asks his imam, his doctor, and Mullah Nasruddin to put $100,000 in his coffin when he dies?
Oh, yes. That one always makes me chuckle. Classic Mullah Nasruddin.
So after the man dies, the imam and doctor both admit to taking some of the money for themselves.
Right, the imam needed it for the mosque, and the doctor, well, he just couldn't resist the temptation.
But when they turn to Mullah Nasruddin, he proudly proclaims that he kept his promise and put the entire $100,000 in the coffin.
Of course he did.
And when they press him for details, he reveals that he wrote the man a check for the full amount.
Classic Mullah Nasruddin, always one step ahead.
It's a funny reminder that our commitments matter, even those made in jest. And that integrity is about following through on those promises, even when faced with temptation.
It also highlights the importance of examining our motivations. Are we acting out of genuine care for others, or are we driven by self-interest?
Now let's talk about a concept that's central to the book's message, the spirit of service.
Om Swami uses a beautiful story about Maharana Pratap, a courageous ruler, and his humble servant to illustrate what true service means. The servant notices that the mangoes are sour, so he eats 7 of them so his master won't have to.
What a selfless act. It really speaks to the idea of putting someone else's needs before your own.
Exactly. It's about acting from a place of genuine compassion without any expectation of reward or recognition.
It reminds us that even small acts of kindness can make a world of difference.
Now, to contrast that spirit of service, Swami shares a classic parable about heaven and hell. Both are depicted as banquet halls filled with delicious food, but there's a twist. Everyone's arms are splinted, so they can't feed themselves.
That's a clever setup. So what distinguishes heaven from hell in this scenario?
Well, in hell, everyone is miserable and starving because they are too focused on their own suffering to help each other.
Their selfishness creates their own personal hell.
Exactly. But in heaven, despite having the same physical limitations, the people are joyful and feeding each other, making sure everyone can enjoy the abundance of the feast.
What a beautiful illustration of cooperation and shared joy. It highlights how much our actions and attitudes toward others shape our experience of life.
Heaven and hell in this context aren't physical places, but rather reflections of our choices and the energy we bring to our interactions.
So by choosing kindness, compassion, and cooperation, we're creating a little piece of heaven on earth, not just for ourselves, but for those around us.
Precisely. It's about realizing that our well-being is interconnected, and that by contributing to the well-being of others, we ultimately benefit ourselves.
Now, I want to touch on a theme that has come up throughout our conversation, the importance of choosing positivity.
It's a recurring theme in the book. Om Swami tells a story about watching TV with his neighbor, and they come across a KKK rally, then environmental protests, and finally some heated political debates.
So a diverse mix of viewpoints and causes.
Right. But what he observes is that despite the differences, the common denominator is anger and negativity. He notices that the expressions of rage and bitterness are the same, whether it's coming from hate groups, activists, or politicians.
It's fascinating how negativity can take so many different forms, but have the same underlying energy.
It makes you wonder, are we contributing to the negativity, or are we choosing to be a source of positivity and light?
It's a powerful question that makes us look at our own thoughts, words, and actions and think about the impact we have on the world.
Choosing positivity doesn't mean ignoring the problems or pretending everything is perfect. It's about cultivating an attitude of love, kindness, and understanding, even when faced with difficulties.
And remembering that negativity ultimately hurts us more than it hurts anyone else.
Exactly. Now let's shift gears to a lighter topic. Remember the story about the boy who was afraid of an alligator in the water hole?
Oh, yes. That one always brings a smile on my face.
This little boy is terrified of going to the water hole because he believes there's an alligator in there. His grandmother tries to comfort him, saying that the alligator is probably more afraid of him than he is of it.
And the boy, being so innocent and logical, replies, "Well, Grandma, if he's as scared of me as I am of him, then that water ain't fit to drink." It's a hilarious reminder that our fears, even if they seem justified, can be irrational and stop us from enjoying simple things.
If we let fear control us, we miss out on the abundance life offers.
Now let's delve into the complexities of love loss and the search for connection.
Om Swami has met so many people who are struggling with their relationships or feeling lonely. It seems like many are searching for a sense of belonging and connection.
It's a paradox. We're more connected than ever through technology, yet so many people feel isolated.
He observes that a lot of people believe finding the one will solve all their problems and bring them everlasting happiness.
It's that fairy tale idea of happily ever after.
Right. But he also points out that even those in committed relationships can still feel unfulfilled. Maybe they're craving more freedom or a different kind of connection. It really highlights how complicated love and happiness can be.
It seems like sometimes the reason for our unhappiness might be deeper than the relationship itself.
He emphasizes that genuine love and lasting happiness must first be cultivated within ourselves.
So we shouldn't expect someone else to make us happy. We need to find that happiness within.
Exactly. It's about moving from a place of neediness to a place of wholeness and abundance.
It reminds me of that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about the challenges of maintaining healthy relationships once we found them.
It often feels like staying in love is harder than falling in love.
They definitely require effort, compromise, and a willingness to grow and evolve together. And that's not always easy. It's easy to fall into the trap of wanting to change our partners, especially when the initial excitement fades and we're dealing with the day-to-day realities of being in a relationship.
We start to notice their flaws, their quirks, and we might try to mold them into our ideal version of a partner.
And to illustrate this, Swami uses a really thought-provoking analogy from Nassim Taleb's book, The Bed of Procrustes.
Oh, right. The innkeeper who would stretch or amputate his guests to fit them into his bed.
Exactly. It's a strong metaphor for how we can distort our relationships by trying to force our partners into a mold that we've created.
So acceptance is key.
Yes, accepting our partners for who they are, flaws, and while also allowing space for growth and change.
That sounds like a tricky balance.
It is. It requires open communication, compassion, and a willingness to let go of our need to control the relationship or the other person.
It's about honoring their individuality while also nurturing the connection.
Exactly. And to tie this back to what we were talking about earlier, living with intention and purpose is crucial in relationships too.
It's about being present and appreciating those little moments with our loved ones.
Right. It's about realizing that our time together is precious and we should cherish it.
Now let's explore the challenge of dealing with betrayal and staying true to our values in tough situations.
Betrayal can be incredibly painful. It can really shake our trust in people.
It can make you question everything.
The book addresses this with a story about a military lieutenant who defies orders to rescue his wounded comrade. He knows he could die, but he goes anyway.
Wow, that's a powerful act of loyalty.
Tragically, his friend dies, but the lieutenant finds some peace in knowing he honored his commitment and brought comfort to his comrade in his final moments.
It reminds us that sometimes doing the right thing means making personal sacrifices.
And it highlights the importance of acting in accordance with our values, even when it's difficult or might have negative consequences.
Now, for a lighter story about betrayal, remember the one about the man who asks his imam, his doctor, and Mullah Nasruddin to put $100,000 in his coffin when he dies?
Oh, yes. That one always makes me smile. It's a classic Mullah Nasruddin story.
So after the man passes away, the imam and the doctor admit to taking some of the money for their own purposes.
The imam needed it for the mosque, and the doctor, well, he just couldn't resist the temptation.
Right. But then they turn to Mullah Nasruddin, and he proudly declares that he kept his promise and put the full $100,000 in the coffin.
Of course he did.
And when they ask him to explain, he reveals that he simply wrote the man a check for the full amount.
Mullah Nasruddin, always thinking outside the box.
It's a funny story, but it reminds us that integrity is about following through on our commitments even when faced with temptation.
And it reminds us to check our motivations. Are we acting from a place of genuine care, or are we driven by self-interest?
Now let's talk about one of the most important themes in the book, the spirit of service.
Om Swami tells a story about a courageous ruler and his servant. The servant notices that the mangoes are sour and eats 7 of them so his master won't have to.
That's a beautiful example of selfless service, putting someone else's well-being before your own.
It shows that true service comes from a place of pure compassion and isn't about seeking rewards or recognition.
Sometimes it's those small acts of kindness that make the biggest impact.
Absolutely. Now, to contrast that idea, Om Swami shares the parable of heaven and hell. Both are depicted as banquet halls full of delicious food, but everyone's arms are splinted so they can't feed themselves.
That's such an interesting concept. What's the difference between heaven and hell in this story?
In hell, everyone is miserable and starving because they're too focused on their own suffering to help each other.
So their selfishness creates their own personal hell.
Exactly. But in heaven, although they have the same limitations, people are joyfully feeding each other, making sure everyone gets to enjoy the abundance.
It's a great illustration of how cooperation and our attitude towards others can really shape our experience.
Heaven and hell aren't literal places in this story, but rather states of being that are shaped by our choices and how we treat each other.
So by choosing kindness, compassion, and cooperation, we're creating a little piece of heaven on earth.
Exactly. And it all comes back to the idea that our well-being is interconnected. When we help others, we ultimately help ourselves.
I want to touch on a recurring theme in the book, the importance of choosing positivity.
Om Swami shares a story about watching TV with his neighbor, and they come across a KKK rally, environmental protests, and political arguments.
So a pretty diverse mix of viewpoints.
Right. But what he observes is that despite the different contexts, the underlying theme is anger and negativity. He notices that the expressions of anger and bitterness are essentially the same, whether it's coming from hate groups, activists, or politicians.
It's interesting how negativity can manifest in so many different forms, but ultimately it's all the same energy.
It makes you think, are we adding to the negativity in the world, or are we choosing to be a force for positivity?
That's a great question. It makes us examine our own thoughts, words, and actions, and really consider the impact we have on those around us.
Choosing positivity doesn't mean ignoring the problems or pretending everything is perfect. It's about approaching life with an attitude of love, kindness, and understanding, even when things are tough.
And recognizing that holding on to negativity hurts us more than it hurts anyone else.
Exactly. Now let's talk about the story about the boy who is afraid of the alligator in the waterhole.
Oh, yes. That one is so funny.
This young boy is terrified of going to get water because he's convinced there's an alligator lurking in the waterhole.
His grandmother tries to reassure him, saying the alligator's probably more afraid of him than he is of it.
And the boy, with perfect logic, replies, "Well, Grandma, if he's as scared of me as I am of him, then that water ain't fit to drink."
It's a hilarious reminder that our fears, even when they seem justified, can be irrational and prevent us from enjoying the simple things in life.
If we let fear control us, we miss out on so much.
Now let's dive into the complexities of love loss and the search for connection.
Om Swami has encountered so many people struggling with relationships and feelings of loneliness. It's such a common human experience. We all crave connection.
It's almost like a paradox. We're more connected than ever through technology, but so many people feel alone and isolated.
Many believe that finding the one will magically solve all their problems and bring them lasting happiness.
It's that classic fairy tale idea of finding your soulmate and living happily ever after.
But he also points out that even people in committed relationships can feel unfulfilled or like something is missing. It really shows that happiness and love is not always as straightforward as we might think.
So sometimes the source of our unhappiness is deeper than the relationship itself.
Exactly. The book emphasizes that true love and lasting happiness come from within. We have to find that sense of wholeness and fulfillment in ourselves first.
We can't rely on someone else to make us happy.
Right. It's about shifting from a place of lack and neediness to a place of wholeness and abundance.
It reminds me of that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup. You have to fill your own cup first.
Now let's talk about the challenges of maintaining those healthy relationships as we found them.
It often feels like staying in love is harder than falling in love.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It takes effort, compromise, and a willingness to grow and evolve together.
And it's easy to fall into the trap of wanting to change our partners, especially when that initial honeymoon phase fades.
Right. We might start to focus on their flaws and try to mold them into our idea of the perfect partner.
The book uses a great analogy from Nassim Taleb's The Bed of Procrustes to illustrate this.
Oh, yes. The innkeeper who would stretch or amputate his guests to fit them into his bed.
It's a powerful image of how our attempts to force our partners to change can backfire and ultimately damage the relationship.
Acceptance is so important. Accepting our partners for who they are, flaws and all.
It's about honoring their individuality while also nurturing the connection we share.
Exactly. And that connects back to what we were discussing earlier about living with intention and purpose. This applies to relationships as well.
It's about being present, appreciating the small moments, and cherishing our loved ones.
Exactly. Now let's explore the challenging topic of betrayal and how we can navigate those difficult situations while staying true to ourselves.
Betrayal can be such a heartbreaking experience. It can really shake your faith in people.
The book opens this section with a powerful story about a military lieutenant who defies orders to rescue his wounded comrade. He knows he's risking his own life, but he goes anyway.
That's a powerful example of loyalty and courage.
Tragically, his friend dies, but he finds solace in knowing that he honored his commitment and brought comfort to his dying comrade.
It reminds us that sometimes doing the right thing requires great sacrifice.
It highlights the importance of acting according to our values, even when it's difficult or unpopular.
Now, for a later story about betrayal, remember the one about the man who asks his imam, his doctor, and Mullah Nasruddin to each put $100,000 in his coffin when he dies?
Oh, yes, that's a classic Mullah Nasruddin story.
After the man dies, the imam and the doctor confess to taking some of the money for themselves.
Right. The imam needed it for the mosque, and the doctor, well, he just couldn't resist.
But when they ask Mullah Nasruddin what he did, he proudly proclaims that he kept his promise and put the full $100,000 in the coffin.
Of course he did.
And when they press him for details, he reveals that he wrote the man a check for the full amount.
Always the trickster.
It's a humorous reminder that our commitments are important and that integrity means following through on our promises, even when faced with temptation.
It also reminds us to check our motivations. Are we acting out of genuine care for others, or are we driven by self-interest?
Now let's talk about one of the most important themes in the book, the spirit of service.
Om Swami tells a heartwarming story about a ruler and his servant. The servant notices that the mangoes are sour, so he eats 7 of them so his master won't have to.
That's true selflessness, putting another person's well-being ahead of your own.
It shows that true service comes from a place of compassion, not a desire for rewards or recognition.
Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can make the biggest difference.
Absolutely. And to contrast that idea, Om Swami shares the classic parable of heaven and hell. Both are depicted as banquet halls filled with delicious food, but there's a catch. Everyone's arms are splinted so they can't feed themselves.
That's such a clever idea. So what makes heaven different from hell in this story?
In hell, everyone is miserable and starving because they're so focused on their own suffering that they won't help each other.
So their selfishness creates their own personal hell.
Exactly. But in heaven, even though they have the same physical limitations, the people are joyfully feeding each other, making sure everyone gets to enjoy the feast.
It's a beautiful illustration of how cooperation and our attitude towards others can create a completely different experience.
Heaven and hell in this context aren't places but states of being shaped by our choices and how we treat each other.
So by choosing kindness, compassion, and cooperation, we're creating a little piece of heaven on earth.
Precisely. It all comes back to the idea that we're all interconnected. When we help others, we help ourselves.
Now, I want to bring up a theme that's been woven throughout our conversation: the importance of choosing positivity.
Om Swami tells a story about watching TV with his neighbor, and they see a KKK rally, environmental protests, and some political arguments.
So, a pretty diverse mix of viewpoints and causes.
Right. But what he notices is that despite the different contexts, the common thread is anger and negativity.
It's fascinating how negativity can take on so many different forms.
And he observes that the expressions of anger and bitterness are the same, whether it's coming from hate groups, activists, or politicians.
It really makes you think, are we adding to the negativity in the world, or are we choosing to be a source of positivity and light?
It's a question we should all ask ourselves. It challenges us to really examine our own thoughts, words, and actions and be mindful of the impact we have on those around us.
And it underscores the idea that negativity, regardless of its source or target, creates the same destructive energy.
Choosing positivity doesn't mean ignoring the world's problems or pretending everything is perfect. It's about cultivating a mindset of love, kindness, and understanding, even when faced with challenges.
And recognizing that negativity ultimately harms us more than it harms anyone else.
Exactly. Now let's switch gears and talk about the story of the boy who was afraid of the alligator in the water hole.
Oh, yes. That one always makes me smile.
This little boy is terrified of going to the water hole because he's convinced there's an alligator lurking there. His grandmother tries to reassure him, saying that the alligator is probably more afraid of him than he is of it.
And the boy, with his innocent logic, replies, "Well, Grandma, if he's as scared of me as I am of him, then that water ain't fit to drink." It's a funny reminder that sometimes our fears, even when they seem rational, can be blown out of proportion and prevent us from enjoying the simple things.
If we let fear dictate our choices, we miss out on so much.
Now let's delve into the complexities of love loss and the search for true connection.
Om Swami shares a lot of insights from his own experience about the challenges people face in relationships and with feelings of loneliness. It seems like so many people are searching for that sense of belonging and connection.
It's like we're more connected than ever through technology yet.
So many people feel isolated and disconnected.
It's a strange paradox, isn't it?
It is. And Om Swami observes that a lot of people believe finding the one will solve all their problems and make them happy forever.
That happily ever after idea.
But he also points out that even those who are in relationships can feel unfulfilled. Maybe they're looking for more freedom or just a different kind of connection.
So sometimes the source of unhappiness runs deeper than the relationship itself.
Exactly. And he emphasizes this really important point. True love and lasting happiness have to start from within.
So we can't expect someone else to complete us or make us happy if we haven't done that work ourselves.
Precisely. It's about shifting from a place of neediness to a place of wholeness.
Which reminds me of that story about the man who went mad after his girlfriend broke up with him.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That one's both funny and insightful. It shows how dangerous it can be to make your happiness entirely dependent on another person.
It's a reminder that we're responsible for our own happiness.
Now, once we've cultivated that sense of inner wholeness, how do we navigate the challenges of maintaining healthy relationships?
It often feels like staying in love is harder than falling in love.
Absolutely. Relationships take effort and compromise and a willingness to grow together.
And it's easy to fall into the trap of wanting to change our partners.
Right. Especially when that initial excitement fades. We might start to notice their flaws and try to mold them into what we want them to be.
To illustrate this point, Om Swami uses that analogy from the bed of Procrustes.
Oh, yeah. The innkeeper who would stretch or amputate his guests to make them fit his bed.
It's a powerful image of how trying to force our partners to change can actually harm the relationship.
The key is accepting our partners for who they truly are, imperfections,
Yeah.
and while also allowing space for growth.
It sounds like a delicate balance.
It is. It requires open communication, compassion, and letting go of the need to control.
It's about honoring their individuality and nurturing the connection we share.
Exactly. And this connects back to what we discussed earlier about living with intention and purpose. It applies to relationships as well.
It's about cherishing those special moments and nurturing those bonds that bring us joy.
Now let's explore the difficult topic of betrayal and how to navigate those situations with integrity.
Betrayal can be such a painful experience.
It can really shake your trust in people. Swami opens this section with a story about a military lieutenant who defies orders to rescue his wounded comrade.
That's a powerful example of loyalty and courage.
He puts his own life on the line, but unfortunately his friend dies. However, he finds solace in knowing he honored his commitment and brought comfort to his friend in his final moments.
Sometimes doing what's right means making sacrifices.
It highlights the importance of staying true to our values even when it's difficult.
Now, for a slightly lighter story about betrayal, remember the one about the man who asked his imam doctor and Mullah Nasruddin to put $100,000 in his coffin?
Oh yes, classic Mullah Nasruddin.
After the man dies, the imam and doctor both admit to taking some of the money.
They had their reasons, of course.
But when they ask Mullah Nasruddin what he did, he proudly declares that he kept his promise and put the entire amount in the coffin.
Of course he did.
And when they press him for details, he reveals that he wrote the man a check.
Mullah Nasruddin always finds a clever way.
It's a funny story, but it reminds us that our commitments matter. Integrity means following through on our promises.
And it highlights the importance of checking our motivations. Are we acting from a place of genuine care or self-interest?
Now let's talk about the spirit of service, which is a core concept in the book.
Om Swami tells a heartwarming story about a ruler and his servant. The servant sees that the mangoes are sour, so he eats 7 of them to spare his master from the unpleasant taste.
What a beautiful example of selfless service, putting another person's needs before your own.
It shows that true service comes from a place of compassion without any expectation of reward.
Sometimes those small acts of kindness are the most meaningful.
Absolutely. To contrast that idea, Om Swami shares the classic parable about heaven and hell. They're both depicted as banquet halls full of delicious food, but everyone's arms are splinted so they can't feed themselves.
That's an interesting concept. So what makes heaven different from hell in this story?
Well, in hell, everyone is miserable because they're focused on their own suffering and won't help each other.
So their selfishness creates their own personal hell.
Exactly. But in heaven, despite having the same limitation, everyone is joyful because they're feeding each other, ensuring everyone can enjoy the abundance.
That's a great illustration of how cooperation and kindness can create a totally different experience.
Heaven and hell aren't literal places in this parable, but rather states of being. They're determined by our choices and actions.
So it's really about recognizing our interconnectedness and understanding that by helping others, we ultimately help ourselves.
Exactly. Now, as we wrap up this deep dive into big questions of life, what are your biggest takeaways?
You know, one of the most powerful messages for me is that true happiness comes from within. It's not about chasing external things, but about cultivating self-awareness, compassion, and a deep connection with our true selves.
That's a beautiful insight. And it connects with so many of the themes we've explored today, like managing our thoughts, choosing positivity, embracing forgiveness, and finding that balance between our inner and outer worlds.
It's about recognizing that we have the power to create a more meaningful and fulfilling life, not by changing external circumstances, but by changing our perspective.
If you're interested in exploring these ideas further, check out lingopediamagazine.com. They have a great selection of courses and ebooks on personal growth, spirituality, and mindfulness.
That's a great resource. And of course, we encourage everyone to pick up a copy of Big Questions of Life by Om Swami. It's a truly insightful and inspiring read.
It's been a pleasure diving deep into this book with you today.
And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, and like. We'll be back next week with another deep dive. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those big questions.